Hey guys, welcome to Barbarous Words with Aequus Nox. Today's episode is really exciting because we're going to be talking about ancestral veneration with my friend Ash from Word and Weave, which is a topic that is really important to me because it has become such a big part of my daily practice. And he offers an ancestral veneration mentoring package on his site, which I did and found insanely helpful. So we're going to be talking about that today. But to get started, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your magical background and story?
Ciao Benedettos, I'm Asphodelo of Ward and Weave, but everyone calls me Ash. So my magical background is a little bit complex. I am not a huge fan of the whole concept of like being a born witch or witch blood or anything like that, but I do come from a family of people who do practice magic. And ancestral veneration is actually the first magical system that people in my family are initiated into. And by and large, ancestors are the spirits that are closest to us. So in my own family's particular model of magic, it's very natural and it's very easy to become part of because it's already within you. Your ancestors love you, they look over you, they are with you, they are invested in you in the context of like healthy, well, and healed ancestors. But yes, ancestral veneration is sort of, in my own personal, very unbiased opinion, the foundation of a really healthy and functional magical practice. But that's my own biases. And I suppose aside from my background as a person who grew up with this sort of stuff, I grew up on a cattle farm. Uh, my first trade was actually as a chef, so I put myself through university by working in kitchens. And I spent the last 10 years working professionally as a remedial massage therapist, working with physiotherapy and that sort of stuff. And now here I am doing professional occult things.
So you're basically a really good people and spirit person.
It's sort of one of those things that my own personal drive in life has always been to help people. And when I was a kid, like the occult today is so much more accessible and it's so more readily aware. Like you can walk into bookshops and find things that are not Wicca
Yeah.
and not like some form of like earth-based spirituality. You know, there's this really wonderful book that came out last year, Mallory Vaudois' Honoring Your Ancestors, and that book is now the foundational textbook that I recommend to everybody because I'm just kind of like, you want to be a better psychic? Work with this. You want to be a better medium? Work with this. You want to start a really healthy and structured magical practice? Work with this. My little copy just here. So this is the book that I actually recommend for people. And for me, because I also come from an Italian background, like the wonderful lady who wrote this book, it was one of those things that I was reading it and I just went, oh my gosh, like this so totally mirrors so much of my own experience of what is ancestral veneration and our place in the ecology of the world, so to speak, like how I stand and how I exist within the spiritual overlap of this world that I exist in. And yes, it's a really wonderful book. And aside from my career as a massage therapist, I started reading professionally tarot and other divinatory devices about 12 years ago. So I have had a lot of experience with the new age sort of community that exists today. And back in the day when I did have my own shop and I was running massage and like selling all of those sort of paraphernalias that people expect of like a alternative type shop experience, I was teaching psychic development and mediumship and that sort of stuff to certain people who were interested in those things. And honestly, I wouldn't even bother these days. I'd just be like, read this book, practice the exercises in this book. That's all you need.
Well, I've heard so many good things about that book actually, and I own it, but yeah, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, so I'm gonna move that to the top of my list now. Yeah, so basically, like ancestors have pretty much always been a part of your practice. So it's kind of cool
Yeah.
that there's like something you can recommend for people to read these days, because I didn't have that kind of background.
No, and as a foundational text, like honestly, that book is beyond par. There are other books like Daniel Fore's Ancestral Medicine and that sort of stuff, but as a beginning place, like to really come to understand what we're working with and that sort of stuff, I do recommend honoring your ancestors. And then after you've worked with that a little bit, move on to something like Daniel Fore's Ancestral Medicine, because that is specifically targeting healing ancestors and like doing more intense work on ancestral trauma and that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
So
I have that book as well. I just need to read it. There's just so many books, so I
yeah,
haven't had a
and
chance to read everything I own, but glad I have them, so that's good.
and they are really wonderful resources. Like, I think that's also one of the things that we forget about with occult practice or spiritual practice is there's always new information. Like there's always some books coming out. Like I just recently this week ordered a ridiculous amount of books and they all arrived pretty much on the same day, and I went, I don't know which one I want to read first. I need to read all of them, but you have to prioritize like what you can actually do in a day.
Yeah, and that is kind of like something that I wish I prioritized sooner, honestly. But it's kind of goes back to the next question that I was going to ask you, which is like, what's the benefit of working with our ancestors? Because I think that maybe that's like how it gets overlooked. So I think
Yeah.
if you could kind of put that in perspective, it would help a little bit.
So there are so many benefits to working with ancestors. Like, what are not the benefits of working with ancestors? For myself, as I'd mentioned, I am a psychic medium, and part of ancestral veneration, the way that my family teaches it, is basically what I call the court. So the court is the collection of spirits that surround you, that work with you. And in my own way that I approach magic and the way that I talk about magic is that I am sovereign of my court. So for me, I would call myself the king of my court, sovereign of my court, because I am cisgendered male. Like I identify as a male, I'm comfortable in that. So the court is the collection of spirits that surround you, and the spirits that are closest to us, because ancestors were human, they know us, we share that genomal relationship with them. Like the ancestors that are surrounding us, we do share genetic data with them. It might be many, 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 many generations back, but you have that familial bond with them. And there's always this concern with people of, I have bad ancestors, like I have people who weren't good in life, and that's a really valid concern, because first off, if you are sovereign of your court, you are the ruler of your court, you are the person who gets to dictate what you do and do not do. It's up to you. You're the person in power here. You're the living person. If you decide that you don't want to work with ancestors, that's your choice, that's your prerogative. There are many ancestors myself that I have that I don't work with and that I don't have a relationship with because they in life were not good people. So there is no obligation to work with ancestors who are not healthy for you, who are not well, who were not good people for you. If a person wasn't a good person in life, you're not obligated to work with them.
Yeah.
Just to cover that first, Ancestral Veneration in my own book teaches us autonomy in practice. I'm the person in control. I get to decide what I do and do not do in my life, inclusive of my magical praxis. Well, I suppose really the first big benefit of that is because you have this relationship with the spirits, you already know them, you're aware of them, it's really easy to connect with them. And on one hand, ancestors are really wonderful to work with if you're spiritually sensitive, because they block out a lot of the static that we deal with. I know for myself, when I was a young kid, my mother worked in hospitals. Hospitals were always a really terrible place for me to go to because, surprise, surprise, there's a lot of wandering or lost dead in hospitals. And
Yeah.
if you're a shiny, spiritually sensitive child, they tend to gravitate towards you. And I didn't really start working with ancestral veneration the way that I do today until about 3 years ago. But even before that, I started to really reconnect with my ancestors in a really meaningful, practical way when I was about 18, building up to it sort of until I was 21. The relationship that I had with them did really drastically cut down on the spiritual static that I had to deal with. And so by and large, that's a really wonderful thing, because part of the way that I teach ancestors is that they are intermediaries. They work between us and the world around us, so they can work with spirits of place, they can work with wandering spirits and that sort of stuff, and they are also the intermediaries between us and the divine, gods or powerful beings, or however you like to think of spirit categories and that sort of thing. Well-established, healed, awakened ancestors that you personally are working with and having that conscious relationship with can act as the buffer between you and the spiritual environment around you.
A couple things really quick that I was just thinking about, because so you talk about ancestral court a lot. For those who don't really know what like an ancestral court is, or like how that's part of it, can you kind of like tell who's part of the ancestral court? Because I think a lot of people think it's just your immediate ancestors.
No, well, in often cases it is. So when I refer to the court, I'm simply like, it's largely the spirits that surround us. So in my court, I have ancestors. In my court, I have spirits of place, and I also have divine spirits that I work with and that have that relationship with me. In the context of ancestors, because I do teach ancestral veneration as a mentoring program, I refer to the guardian and the guide. And so these are the two spirits that are closest to us. And it's also how I was taught ancestral veneration by my own people. You have, it's sort of the concept of like a guardian angel, but like most of the guardian angels that people think upon are not actually angels. They're ancestral spirits. They stand really close to us. So the guardian spirit literally is your bouncer. They enforce who gets to be in your court, who gets to interact with you. So by working with your guardian and empowering them, you basically have an aware, intelligent, sentient spirit that is actively working for you, with you, to protect you from, you know, random spirit interactions and that sort of stuff. Like, I personally am a big fan of having a 24/7 bouncer working for me, because, you know, I'm spiritually sensitive and that works for me. Whereas your guide is kind of, for occult practitioners, is often a co-magician or a teacher or facilitator. They tend to act as the spirit who guides you towards magical pathwork that really resonates with you. And especially for ancestral sorts of spirits that you share that bond with, they tend to lead you towards your cultural heritage of magic or your ancestral heritage of magic. Like for myself, because my family are Italian background, and as I've also found out, we're Greek, didn't know that. My own magical praxis has always been very, very intensely drawn to the traditions of the Mediterranean. And so after I had my genetic tests actually done, and I went, wow, that's a lot Greek. Like, that's not a lot but Greek. That's a lot Greek. And my later life draw to working with the Hellenic spirits and Hellenic styles of magic and that sort of stuff made a lot more sense to me, because I was just kind of like, oh, well, that's part of my ancestry.
That's
But,
cool.
you
Yeah.
know, so it,
No, that's super cool. It's something that I think I just missed in the beginning, and so that's why I bring it up, because yeah, like maybe my most immediate ancestors weren't the closest, but I think that there is like a whole wide range that there is available. So yeah, that's why I
yeah,
wanted to talk about that. So one
yeah.
of the things I wanted to ask you was like, how can we strengthen these relationships we have with these ancestral spirits?
Well, by and large, veneration, like to strengthen the bond with spirits, you want to practice what Hellenic people call theurgy. It's a devotional relationship. So, and in no way is this a judgment, but by and large, a lot of the occult praxis that we see falls into the category of vending machine magic. Like, you put in a coin and you get a result, right? And that, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But for myself, because I am very spiritually sensitive and I do interact and speak with spirits as part of my daily practice and for my job, I tend to lean more towards devotional practice. So I have my own planetary magic practice that I do. And so on the days of the week, I do a devotional practice to them. I offer offerings, I commune with them, that sort of stuff. Now, it's the same thing with ancestors. We have this relationship with them, but ancestors fall into the category of what I call lawful spirits, like healthy, well-heeled ancestors that have a vested interest in you are here to support you. They want to work with you. They want to, be part of your life. Like in my own family and in my own understanding of it, ancestors are still part of family. Like if I need to make a really big decision in my life, I'm going to talk about it with them because one, it gives me that space to actually talk about it. It might just be the sounding board of like, I'm thinking about doing this. And, my grandma might just be like, that's a terrible idea. And I just kind of be like, oh, well, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Or it might be like, oh, I'm thinking about planting these kinds of tomatoes. And my grandfather was a prolific gardener. And he'll just be like, oh, this is what you need to do. And I'm like, oh, yeah, cool. That's actually really handy. Thanks, Nono. So it's one of those things that by building up this relationship with them, by giving them offerings, and I myself do a daily practice to my ancestors, and I do recommend best practice, if you can, doing a daily offering. And it can be as simple as just giving a glass of water. It can be as simple as giving candle, water, some incense, a little bit of food, that sort of stuff, because they are human spirits. And so we have to consider the fact that they once existed here, they once knew the pleasures of life and that sort of stuff. And to empower them and to sort of bring them closer to us, like we give them the gifts of what it is to be the pleasure of life. So because they are lawful spirits, we have to invite them into our lives. And one of the ways of doing that is ancestral veneration, to commune with them, to talk to them. And it can be as simple as saying, ancestors, I ask that you be part of my life, intercede on my behalf, that sort of stuff. Be with me, walk with me, invite them to be part of your life. Like I myself, just as an idea of my own personal practice, the first spirits that I greet in the day are my ancestors, and the last spirits that I greet in the day are my ancestors. Like I begin and end my day with them, and I just talk to them and give them their offerings and just be like, I hope that you have a wonderful day. Be with me, be part of my life, walk with me. If I'm ever gonna cook one of Nonna's recipes, can guarantee you she's still gonna pop in and tell me that I'm not doing it right, even though I am a chef. It's one of those things that like you're building up this conscious relationship with them and inviting them to be part of your life. Like,
Yeah, no, I think that's super beautiful. And I guess so when you're like you have this altar and you're putting offerings and stuff on it, what types of other things would you put on your altar? Would you put like pictures, or what types of things are valuable?
yeah. So for people who are wanting to work with really specific ancestors, a good place to start is a photo. Or if you don't have photos of them and you can draw and you know what they look like, you can draw pictures of them and that sort of stuff. But if you don't have photos of people, you could just write out a sheet of their names. You could write out honorifics. If it's an ancestor that you don't know the name of, you can assign and offer honorific to them. She of the golden hair or something along those lines,
Yeah.
because what we're doing is we're describing them. Because like anything, by calling specifically to a spirit, like this is why in Goetia and that sort of stuff, like you have specific conjuring practices, you have a sigil and that sort of stuff. Humans and human spirits, our command word is our name or our honorifics. Like, you want to get the attention of a lord, you would say Lord Branberry, and Lord Branberry is going to turn around to you or something like that. If you want to get my attention, you're either going to say Asphodelo, guarantee you'll get my attention because I live in Australia, not many people can actually say my name. Or if you even say Ash, you're going to get my attention. I'm going to be like, oh, hello. It's the same thing for spirits. Like just simply speaking their names is a way to garner their attention and to bring them closer to you. So, yeah.
I think yeah, that's a really good idea. I thought about doing the list myself, but I haven't actually done that. So thanks for solidifying that I can do that.
Yeah, and it's one, you know, especially for people who don't come from families that collect heirlooms, like you can, if you have heirlooms of a person, or you can get access to them, you can also use those. You can also collect items that were specific to that person. Or if you know that that person had a specific sort of religious spiritual persuasion, like say for instance your grandmother was devoutly Catholic, you could get a statue of the Virgin Mary, you could have rosaries and that sort of stuff. Or for example, my nonna was a bit of a smoker, like many older Italian men. So I'm currently in the process of trying to find a pipe that he actually likes, because he's like, I want a pipe. And I'm like, okay, I'm looking. No, I don't like that one. Okay, cool. So building up your relationship with your ancestors will sort of let them slip into your life as well. Like even when I very first started working with my ancestors, one of the weirdest experiences was I went op shopping, and I'd have nothing against op shopping or anything like that, but I come from a really big family, so I never really needed to buy clothes, especially because I'm not the eldest. So there was never like that thing for me to go op shopping or anything like that. And there was just this one day that I was like, I have to go into this op shop. And I went into the op shop, or I suppose you Americans call them charity stores or something like that. I don't know. In Australia, we call them opportunity shops. And I just sort of went in, and I was just kind of like, oh, I'm going to have a look at this glassware. I really love this vase. I'm going to take this vase, however you prefer to say it. And I brought it home and I was washing it. And as I was washing it, it was Italian crystal. And I'm just kind of like, first off, I got this at an extreme bargain price. And secondly, the irony that I'd found just felt drawn to go into a shop, and I just went, I have to have this. And then got home and looked at it properly and went, oh, it's Italian crystal. My grandparents had a really lovely collection of Italian crystal, but it ended up going to another member of the family when they passed. So
That's really cute. I love that. I always find that magic has a way of just bringing things to you when you need them.
yeah.
And at a really good deal. So I love that. So what are some like best practices for like refreshing the things that are on your altar?
For myself, I do it daily. Well, for example, I put flowers on my altars because for one of my own personal stances of working with spirits is you want to make the space beautiful, specifically ancestors. You know, on one hand, like we have to consider the consciousness of death that exists for us. It's not exactly a beautiful thing. Like many people are frightened of death, and when you think about traditional practices, you're buried in the ground. Being buried in the ground is cold and dark, and you're devoid of light and joy and beauty and all of that sort of stuff. And it is by nature dirty. So one of the things, like Mallory will say in her book, put out a white altar cloth, because white altar cloths are purity. And, you know, especially if you come from a Catholic background or a Christian background or any sort of like the modern spiritual practices, so to speak, white is associated with purity and sanctity and all of that sort of stuff. So it just sort of creates like that hygienic, clean environment. And you know, I put out flowers, but my flower offerings stay on the altar for a week. Or if the water gets dirty or something like that, I'll change out the water and refresh it and that sort of stuff. Whereas for small offerings, so for example, my daily devotional practice at the moment is I light a candle, I put out a shot glass of coffee in the morning, in the evening I'll put out another libation for my ancestors, wine, something along those lines, and food. And so one of my most recommended offerings for all categories of spirits, because it's very universally well received in my own experience, is apples cut into wedges and drizzled with some honey and dusted with cinnamon.
Yeah.
And I have to say, like in my own experience, I've actually only been doing that for about 2 or 3 weeks now, or something along those lines. Whereas previously, there's this particular type of biscuit that my ancestors really like, and so I would just put out a biscuit and a little pinch of tobacco, and maybe a little square of chocolate is like my usual daily offerings for the ancestors, because I like to keep them well fed because we do so much work together. Whereas now I'm putting out the offering of apple and honey and cinnamon for all of my altars in the house. And part of the way that I approach offerings is if you put something out in the morning and you take it away after sunset, that's your diurnal cycle is done. And so all of the spiritual practices and that sort of stuff that you've done during the day, by nature, are sort of reset in the evening. So at the end of the day, I clean off my altar. I know some people, some practices are like, oh, leave wine on your altar until it goes sour because then it's done. I'm not about that life. Like,
Yeah.
I've never had a spirit say to me, I want you to leave offerings on my altar until they go bad. You know, that's not been my own experience of it. And it's just it's a personal thing for me. If leaving it, if a spirit said to me, leave offerings on my altar until they go rancid, sure, I'd do it. But none of my spirits have ever been like that. And specifically, my ancestors are very clean people. Like, my nonna's house was impeccably clean. Like, you couldn't touch a surface in the house and find dust. So I found myself that if I didn't regularly sort of clean my altar spaces and that sort of stuff, I'd get nagged and just be like, you need to clean it. The longest I'll leave out an offering is until the next morning. You know, if it's been one of those things, because I do refresh my offerings every day. But for something like flowers, which are not perishable like food and that sort of stuff, and also like seasonality has to come into play as well. If you're putting out offerings in summer, they're going to go bad faster because that's the nature of the world. It's more humid, it's hot, and that sort of thing. Whereas in winter, it's cold, and for some parts of the world, it snows, and you live in like actual freezing temperatures. So you can leave out offerings, and they're not going to go bad as fast. And so on a time frame wise, I tend to find in my own experience that if I've given offerings to spirits, they're usually done with them by half an hour, like 30 minutes, and the spirits have taken the spiritual sustenance of the thing. And so that's really wonderful. But there are some times that a spirit, like, especially we're coming up to spooky season, so I believe it's a dumb dinner or something like that. I'm not fully aware of some of the customs that you guys have. But putting out your overnight offerings to the spirits of All Hallows Eve or Samhain, or however you prefer to call it, you would probably leave that out overnight and that sort of stuff. And then in the dawn of the new day, because that's like, you know, one of the dark nights of the year and that sort of stuff, you would change it out. Like, so there's nothing wrong with leaving it out overnight or for a day or that sort of thing. But for me, part of my hygiene of disposing of offerings is because I do give offerings so regularly, and it's just a respect thing. Like, some people will be like, oh, you can leave your offering glass of water on an altar for a week, just change it out if it looks gross. I personally change out water every day. Like, if I'm giving offerings of water as a libation to spirits, I refresh them every day because I have a relatively large garden, and so I just use the water from the day before to water my garden, because it's then in turn nourishing the earth to give forth more offerings. So there's that spiritual sort of economy and ecology there of not necessarily being wasteful, but also like giving them what is fresh. Because again, we are really trying to give the gift of life force to our spirits, like leaving something that's had all of the spirit and the energy and the life force taken from it. You're not really giving them anything other than the physical prop of it. Like, if you're wanting to really empower spirits and get them to be powerful and awake and involved in your life, give them a shot of coffee in the morning. I know that that makes me far more involved in my own personal life. And giving them fresh offerings of food, like I know that I need to eat fresh food, and so it's part of that, the way of thinking about it, like, you know,
Yeah, just kind
being
of like you would
respectful.
engage with your family anyways. So,
Yeah, it's like, I'm not going to feed, like, I have nothing against leftovers, but leftovers don't really exist in my house. So, you know, I tend to just cook every day. I give offerings every day. It's one of those things. It's convenient for me.
yeah, no, proper manners. I think that's really good.
Yeah.
So, what is the, I guess, how do I put this question? Like, what do our ancestors gain by being venerated and by us like working with them?
See, this is now we're going into the territory of anatomy of spirit. So this is my own personal best understanding, and I don't for a moment consider that I'm right, because it really depends on the cosmology that you personally buy into. What is your concept of the afterlife? What do you believe in? In my own family, we do believe in reincarnation. And so, like, I don't, there isn't really a better word for it, but, you know, you look at, there's many, many, many different cultures that have reincarnation as part of that practice. So for me, as I understand it, and the soul, what people think of as the soul, is the animating force, and it comes and it inhabits the body. And in larger cosmological models, like, we refer to the moon being the gateway of souls, because it's the portal that all of the planetary rays come into the earth. It's also how all spirits enter into the earth and into the earth's sort of biosphere. So the soul is put into your body, and I'm not going to debate when the soul becomes housed in the body, because it's never really housed. When you sleep and you dream, your soul's off doing its adventures on the astral plane, whatever. So the soul itself is the animating force, and it represents everything that you've done in previous lives. So some people call it the Akashic records, the Hall of Records. Basically, you have a spiritual library that exists that tells the story of who you are and the lives that you've lived. And so that soul, the animating force, like the white globule of pure spirit, comes and it inhabits your body, and that's what sort of gives us the animating life force. When we die, that soul goes on and it reincarnates. Like, that is my own personal best understanding of it. It's devoid of the human experience, like, it's the cumulative experience, but it's literally a part of the divine, the collected consciousness, the all, whatever you want to call it. So it's kind of a little bit devoid of the whole human experience. It's like, oh, I've been through all of this before. Next,
Yeah.
until I reach ascension or nirvana or whatever. Whereas the spirit, now, this is what we're really working with. The spirit is me. So when I die, my soul is going to reincarnate, but the psychic imprint, the spirit, the personality, the force of everything that was me shall exist. And so when I die, you'll be able to have a conversation with me and just be like, Asphodelo. I'm probably going to be a stickler about that when I do die. I'm just going to throw that out there. If anyone wants to try and summon me when I eventually do die, you're going to have to use my actual name. So it's you know, when we pass, and this is the spirits that we see of people, you know, after people die, and like we see grandma and that sort of stuff. It's not her soul, it's her spirit. It's the personality, it's the impression, it's the experiences of who she was. Now, by and large, and keeping in mind, I come from a tradition where we have to remember our dead, because if we don't remember them, the spirit fades. It fades into obscurity. And this has existed in all sorts of mythologies. Like, my understanding is that Christianity and Catholicism and that whole concept of the afterlife, where you go into heaven and you exist for eternity and that sort of stuff, is pretty singular. Like, if take for example the ancient Greeks, the concept of the afterlife was you have to be remembered by your descendants, and by being remembered by your descendants, you are fed and empowered, and your spirit becomes crystallized and that sort of stuff. And when there is no one who remembers your name, you fade. You become part of the amorphous horde of spirits, which falls into the purvey of Hecate, the goddess who is the goddess of the dead and who has the wandering horde of aurorae, you know, of those nameless spirits that seek out to do her work. And it's one of those things that my own experience of this is that eventually spirits do fade. And part of the way that we can circumvent that is by remembering them and giving them veneration and offerings. Now, there are a couple of asides to this, because again, let's take, for example, Catholicism and saints. Saints were humans, And so what's happened with them, they've been remembered by so many people, they've been prayed to by so many people, they exist in the human consciousness. Those once human spirits have transcended and become something else. They are a saint, they are a powerful spiritual force. The thing that is the true reality of this is you can do this with your own ancestors. You can exalt your ancestors, transcend your ancestors to become, for lack of a better term, what I consider to be a demigod. The ancient Greeks called them heroes, like great, powerful spirits would become heroes or essentially demigods, like Heracles. Heracles was a human at one point in the mythology. And so by venerating ancestors, we are empowering them. We are crystallizing their life force, like, well, not their life force, but their spiritual force. They are becoming a solidified concept. As long as their names are remembered, as long as they exist in human consciousness, this is a powerful saint, for lack of a better term, a human spirit that can actively intercede on our behalf and the behalf of others. Now, as I had mentioned, there are exceptions to the rules. People who practice magic are alchemizing or going through an alchemical process spiritually, because what we're doing is we are remembering our connection to the divine, so to speak, like the transcendence. If you're working through the planetary spheres and all of that sort of stuff, you are literally taking the essence of a divine being and embracing it within yourself, and that crystallizes your spirit. So where a non-magical practitioner, a non-spiritually evolved person, like you could be Hindu, you could be a really spiritually empowered Catholic person and have a really crystallized spirit. It doesn't matter how you do it. But those people who really seem to embrace spiritual practice and like empower their own spirit, their spirits have a much more long-lasting presence. I've met spirits that have been dead for thousands of years and haven't been venerated and still exist as they were. So, you know, it's one of those things. Like, what we're really looking at here is we're looking at the fact that we are in fact spirits ourselves. Like we are part of the divine in a human vessel, experiencing the world and the life and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. But ultimately, we have that essence of the divine within us. And so if we do spiritual practices and that sort of stuff, we empower our spirits. And so they do become crystallized in an essence, or by venerating our own ancestors, we are crystallizing them so that they don't fade into obscurity. It's more, and that's really what they're getting out of it. Like,
No, I love
not,
it. It's like
yeah.
mutually beneficial, basically.
Well, and that's the thing, like, because I always talk, this is a reciprocal mutual relationship of love. It's not compelled, it's not necessary, it's none of those things. But if you choose to practice ancestral veneration, it's really benefiting you and your ancestors simultaneously. Because if and I don't mean to make people feel like, oh no, that's terrible if I forget grandma. Like, at some point she'll fade into obscurity. The spirit that was grandma will fade into obscurity, but her soul, that animating force, is going to exist into perpetuity. Like, you know, if one day the universe ends, then we all end. But at the same time, if that doesn't happen, then the things that she was will exist forever.
Yeah, no, I love that. And so I guess I'm kind of down to like my last question for you, and then I want to talk about something else really cool. So you mentioned a couple times healed and well ancestors, and I think that this is just something that we talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but healed and well ancestors, I think, are like really important to talk about because, as you mentioned, you don't really have to necessarily work with all of them. So,
Yeah.
can you just kind of elaborate on what healed and well ancestors are? How can you tell? What's the best way to go about that?
My advice for that is sometimes it's easier to actually work with somebody who does this sort of work. This is ultimately why I started offering ancestral veneration mentoring to people, to put you in a position that you could connect with your guide and guardian, who are by definition healed and well ancestors who have a vested interest in your well-being and your good. So the reason as to why we work with these ancestors is because they have transcended past the egotism that is inherent in human experience. Like, say for instance, for myself, now my biological family is divided into my father, who is Spanish, and his family are very Spanish Catholic, and my mum, who her family were travelers and have Italian heritage, and we have a very different view on the world. Now, when I came out to my family as a non-heteronormative person, my dad's family totally excommunicated me. I got excommunicated from the church, everything like that. So I was cast out of their life. A really interesting thing that happened prior to that, like I was 18 when that happened, but when I was 16, my great-grandmother, who I was very close to in life, passed. And usually when people in my family die, they come and say goodbye to me, or, hey, can you let such and such know this? Now, I was very close to her. And so the fact that I got a phone call in the morning and it's like, oh, Abuela died. And I'm like, what? That's okay. So I went looking for her spirit, and I was just kind of like, Abuela, are you okay? Like, you didn't come and say goodbye to me. And I remember it so vividly. She looked at me and she went, oh, it's you. And I'm like, that's not how she ever spoke to me in life, you know. And I was just like, are you okay? Is there anything that I can do for you? And she said to me straight up, you were never part of this family. And I went, okay. Total flips of my experience of that. And then a couple of years later, when I came out and I lost my entire family, I just went, yeah, actually, that really makes sense right there. So in the context of like well ancestors, I don't consider them to be well because they don't have a vested interest in me living my life and being happy and experiencing joy and that sort of stuff. When we're talking about well ancestors, we're talking about the ancestors that themselves are healed. They've gone past their own trauma. They've gone past their indoctrination of the world that exists today. Like, we're living in the most queer, well, we aren't actually living in the most queer aspect of human history. I mean, look at the ancient Greeks, look at ancient Egypt and that sort of stuff. But we're living in a society now that people are coming back to the realization, well, actually heteronormative isn't the norm. Like, you know, it's not actually the expectation. And so we're living in a time now that people are less religious than they've ever been. They're less spiritual than they've ever been, and they're less inclined towards that whole heteronormative nuclear family sort of model that we grew up in. And so some of the spirits that are attached to that are not going to look upon the way that you're living your life favorably. Like, say, for instance, if you come from a really Catholic background and you start practicing magic, chances are the really Catholic ancestors who still buy into that cosmology of like the church doctrine and that sort of stuff are going to be unhappy that you're practicing that. And so they're not going to have your best vested interests in mind. And so that's not a good ancestor for you to work with. In some, like in some cases, you know, the spirits will come from times where, let's say, for instance, slavery still existed, and you might be a Caucasian person and you end up marrying someone who's not Caucasian. That ancestor's probably not going to look favorably upon that relationship. There are ways that you can heal the ancestors, and Daniel Four talks about it in his Ancestral Medicine. You can look into ancestral trauma healing. There are transcendence practices that you can do as well, moving them past their, you know, misogynistic, racist, homophobic opinions that they held in life that in all likelihood they still hold in death. So that's not a well ancestor. Like, I myself don't want ancestors who are just kind of like, you shouldn't be practicing magic, you shouldn't be living your best life of non-heteronormity. And I'm just kind of like, I don't want that in my life, because you're going to cause problems. So it's really interesting that healed and well ancestors are lawful spirits, but unwell ancestors are not lawful spirits, and they will actively work against you to do things. Like, I've had clients that started working through ancestral trauma as their first place of call, and then have had nightmares and experiences that aren't super great, because by starting off with trauma, they basically put chum in the water, and it's like, I'm willing to work with my ancestors, but they're not having that really solid sort of surrounding of well ancestors to buffer what's happening for them. So, I'm not going to say that that's not a great place to start, but if you come from potentially a problematic background, or so many people who were colonized and have experienced racial trauma and that sort of stuff, like, it's kind of better to work with specific ancestors that are well, like either they got a lot of therapy in life, or somehow worked through their trauma in their own way. But ultimately, ancestors are still human spirits. They still have their expectations and their needs. Like, you want to give offerings to your ancestors, you give them things that you like. It's part of the reason why I give tobacco to my nono. He loves smoking, and I'm just kind of like, by giving him that, like, I'm empowering him by giving him something he loves. But the offset is, you can find world ancestors yourself. Sometimes it's trial and error, or you can work with somebody who does work with spirits in that context. And like, it exists in many different spiritual paths. Like, especially for Americans, I know, like, if you find a root worker or a conjurer, or people who practice voodoo or any of that sort of stuff, like, they have a really strong ancestral practice, and so you could get somebody to read about your ancestors and give you an idea. But ultimately, it comes down to, understanding that humans are flawed even when they're dead. And so if a person was incredibly flawed in life, they're still probably going to be flawed in death. And so either you do a lot of prayer on their behalf and seek to transcend them past that trauma, or transition them through that trauma so that they become detached from that, because a well ancestor retains their humanity. Like, they still understand how the world works, and that, we need to eat and we need to pay rent and that sort of stuff. But they transcend past their own biases and that they held in life, and become a little more, I suppose, empowered or enlightened in the context of, they still understand the human experience and the expression of human. Like, we want to express love. We want to experience love. Some people may want to have children, some people won't. But it's also just one of those things that, like, you really do need to sort, like, best practice, healthy, safe, effective practice is finding ancestors that know you as you are, or potentially even have mutual experiences like you had. For people who practice magic, quite commonly, their guide is going to be somebody who practiced a magic that you yourself have a strong sympathy with, that you're interested in. Or you're going to have, like, great aunts or uncles or cousins or great grandparents many times removed, who look upon you in a way that they're loving and devoted and caring of you, that they want to support you. So that's what we're sort of aiming for healthy and well ancestors. We want the ones that have left their own human trauma, their own human expectations behind enough that they can meet you as you are, where you are and what you want to achieve in life. Because, it's complex, and like all things, magic isn't safe. Like, you want to start practicing spirituality or magic or any of that sort of stuff, you have to practice it with the context that not everything is going to have your best interests at heart, and that's inclusive of your ancestors. Like, I know that people don't like hearing that there are inherent risks in things, but driving a car is risky. you know. And it's just like, really, like, if we look at the metaphor of a car, magic is just the vehicle that you are using to direct your life. That's it. And by working with ancestral veneration, we have a ancestrally flavored vehicle. So finding an ancestor that connects to you and that resonates with you and that has the same sort of expectations and experiences of life. Like, if you're a queer person, guarantee you're going to have queer ancestors somewhere in your family tree. You shake, someone's going to fall out eventually. It's just, it exists. Like, you can, it is, I would say, incredibly statistically unlikely that you would not have at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or maybe even 10 ancestors in your ancestral tree that spans back to the beginning of time, for our race at least, who are not going to look upon you with favor, who aren't going to look upon you and be like, yeah, I love this kid. I'm going to do, because again, like, our ancestors are always going to look upon us as children.
Yeah.
Because we're the youngest. Like,
Yeah.
they're going to look upon you as a child, and a healthy, well ancestor is going to be like, I want to protect this child, I want to help this child, and that sort of stuff. Whereas, like, and I suppose probably my final note is, a healthy and well ancestor is all of the good things that we expect about family, that we hope for in family. They love us, they care about us, they are invested in us in a way that sometimes our parents or our grandparents or our cousins or living family aren't, in a way. Because again, we always have to consider, what are the biases of the people that we're interacting with? Like, what are the experiences that these people have and their beliefs and all of that sort of stuff? Well, ancestors have transcended past that, whereas someone who's recently dead, or perhaps wasn't a very good person in life, they can sort of be stuck in that. And so you can work through ancestral trauma healing to heal them, to elevate them, and that sort of stuff. But like always, I recommend starting with well ancestors. And so working with somebody like me, or working with somebody who does ancestral work in whatever way, is honestly the best and safest place to start, unless you yourself are spiritually sensitive and already have a relationship with ancestors.
So yeah, that brings me to my next point, which was such a perfect transition, seriously. So I took your ancestral veneration class that you have on Ward and Weave, and or consultation, I should say. So that was amazing. That I already had started building an ancestral practice, but that definitely filled in a lot of the areas that I had missed. So I highly recommend that if anybody is interested in doing ancestral veneration. He is amazing, and I'm not spiritually sensitive, so that was really a big help to me. So aside from that, like, what else can we look forward to for the future for you?
Well, I'm very excited because this is the first place that I'm actually talking about this. In January of 2021, I'm actually going to be teaching ancestral sorcery through the Blackthorn School. Now, for people who are interested, you can send the Blackthorn School an email and an inquiry, and you'll go on the wait list. And when it gets officially announced, you'll get email confirmation of just letting you know that Ancestral Veneration is now live. You can sign up. So yeah, that's a huge thing.
I'm super excited. That's really awesome. I love the Blackthorn School. I've taken a couple
Yeah,
classes from there, or I'm taking a couple. So I think that's awesome. I'm super excited, and
thank you.
yeah, definitely any information that I can put as like a link down below, let me know so that I can get people in contact with you.
Absolutely.
And yeah, this has been
So
amazing. Like, I'm so excited.
thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you, as it always is. The official course curriculum is going to be released next month. We're doing this discussion in October of 2020. So there is things going to be released as we lead up to it. There's a couple of other little interviews that are going to happen and that sort of stuff. But I'm very excited, and it's going to be a really wonderful experience. And I suppose, like, for those who are interested, the takeaway from this is that my ancestral sorcery course is aimed at you building your own magical practice around ancestors. And like, because again, I think that the whole concept of witch blood is kind of, I don't know, a little irrelevant, because if we are all truly divine, if we all have the capacity to be psychic, if we all have the capacity to be spiritual, we all come from the same place, right? Depending on what your cultural biases are or experiences. But this is aimed at building an effective, personalized magical praxis with your own ancestors and actually building up something that's unique to you and your own people, while providing a framework of, hey, this is actually how you can start building this thing and growing your own organic magic, so to speak. Like having, I think that in the terms of magic, practice far outweighs any study. Like actively practicing magic is in no way comparable to theoretical understanding, because what we're doing when we're actually practicing magic is we're having that experience. Like it's happening to us experientially, it's happening to the world around us, and so that is just, it's incomparable to anything else. So I'm very excited, and I've been having really wonderful feedback from the experiments that I've shared with people and that sort of stuff. And so yeah, I'm very keen. And as I've said, you know, it's a pleasure talking to you and interacting with you. And I'm so grateful to share about ancestors with people, because as I've mentioned, I'm incredibly unbiased. Ancestors really are where we should start in our magical practice. But you know,
Well, hopefully this will help people get more connected to that, because it's definitely something I missed. So this
yes,
has been really awesome. I appreciate you so much. This will be really helpful. I can't wait to get people in touch with you and kind of see what you're up to. And your new Blackthorn Theme School is amazing. So I'm just so
yes,
happy for
I'm
you.
very
And
like, you know,
this is awesome.
like I kind of, it's like as a kid, because I like, we're Harry Potter generation, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm living my best fantasy. Like I'm going to be a teacher at like the magical school, and I'm just kind of like, oh my god, that's so exciting. But yeah, you know, it's one of those things, and I'm just kind of like, I'm so grateful for the experiences that I've been having and connecting with wonderful people like you, and sharing this gift of, well, I suppose it's a gift of love, because ancestors love us, and by loving them, like, we open up the opportunities for a really, I suppose, meaningful, well, all magic is meaningful in its own way, but experientially understanding sort of how we exist in the world, like it's something beyond compare. So
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's like a
thank you.
beautiful note to end on. I love it so much. I can't wait to post this. Spooky
Thank you.
season for the win. So I hope you have a good day. And yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely, thank you so much.